I'm Jaswinder Bolina. I'm a writer of things, of books and poetry and essays. And now I will let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Victoria Chang, and I am also a writer of things, of poetry, various other kinds of things that probably fall into the hybrid category of essays and lyric poetry. And I also write sometimes for fun children's things too. So I've written some children's picture books, middle grade verse novels, and various sort of whatever catches my, I guess, emotions at the time I just start working on. So yeah, I kind of write. I guess we're both of us are just writers. Is the conclusion of all of this.
Yeah, no, but your oeuvre is more expansive than mine. I mean, and this has been relatively recent, right? Like the children's book only came out like in the last couple of years, and the middle grade novel, I feel like that just is coming out, or is it out yet?
It came out this year.
It
Yeah,
came out
earlier
this
this
year.
year.
Okay.
Yeah. But children's is something I just do for a hobby sort of thing, and so I don't put a lot of effort into it. And I kind of wish I did.
Mm-hmm.
But there's only so many minutes in a day and seconds in a day, as you know, now that you have a child.
I
So
know. I know that's partly your fault that I have a child in the sense that you convinced me that it was a good idea.
This is true. I did.
Because I think we met right around the time I just gotten married or was about to or something like that, and you strongly recommended children, and then we followed that advice, and then the lockdown happened, and there's no daycare, and we're home with him all the time.
So it's my fault.
No, we every single interview I've done in the last like few months, everyone asks like, "Oh, how's the thing?" And it's always about the baby.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
he's home, and we're really thrilled. We've had all this like time. Everybody says, "Oh, it goes so quickly. Enjoyed it goes so quickly." Not when you're home with the baby for 6 straight months. It does not go that quickly. So
Yeah.
in both ways, that's been great. Like
Right.
we get this time, and also that means I don't have a lot of time for writing right now. But
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. No, time is a funny thing with kids. Yeah. I remember those those early months being really, really slow. Like molasses is a word that always came to mind. But yeah, I remember when we met at Idlewild during Idlewild Writers Week. And yeah, I remember talking to you about having children because you, like me, I think had a lot of ambivalence towards that sort of endeavor. And I just never really was certain that I wanted them either. But having had two and have two, that I think that as a writer, um, it definitely can pose challenges for your time, but it made me a better person and a broader person, and I think a better writer in the end. But it definitely was like I call the 10 years, the first 10 years, sort of my lost decade. Like I just it was just, it's a lot
No,
of
but
work.
you were wonderfully honest about the upside and the downside. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was there was no, you did not romanticize anything necessarily, which I think is actually kind of a really convenient segue into talking about your work, because I'm thinking of your most recent National Book Award nominated finalist collection of poetry, but also your prior collections like The Boss and others. You are it's romanticize is an interesting word. I was thinking about this as I read these poems, in the sense that like you write obituaries throughout, and some for really kind of abstract ideas like appetite and secrets and memory and language and logic, and so there's a kind of romantic impulse there to treat these abstractions as like concrete ideas. but there's also like this kind of heavy sobriety in a book called Obit, right? That they're all kind of they're not kind of they're all obituaries.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess maybe the essential question first is sort of, did the obit start happening prior to you thinking you would do a collection of them? And what do you remember the first one, the first obituary or obit poem you wrote?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think, I'm going to pitch this question back at you in a second, because I think it's interesting to talk about where poems come from, where essays come from, where writing, like when, at what point do you start writing something? You know, Vouchna Mort, if I pronounce that correctly, had said recently in an interview that I saw, where for her, a poem starts from silence.
Mm.
And silence is sort of the first impulse of her poetry. And it occurred to me that, these obituaries, I intentionally, didn't want to write elegies. I feel like the elegy is very difficult to write. I feel like everyone's done it and everyone will do it better than me. And so I intentionally just didn't want to write them. And so, but that only lasted so long because in essence, I wrote a bunch of elegies, but it was, I think with looking back on it, I wanted to, I'm always trying new things. Like I'm very sort of enamored with the new and the innovative and the never been done before thing. It's a fatal flaw of mine because, I think it can appear to others as being sort of someone yesterday, my friend yesterday used the word gimmicky. He thought my book before he read it, he's like, oh, I thought it was going to be so gimmicky. And I was like, yeah, I know. It does feel like it could be that way.
Mm.
But I never sat down and said, oh, I'm going to write a bunch of obituaries. That never occurred. For me, I don't work like that. I work more and more sort of like organically and bottoms up, like in front of me is a black wall. And I have no idea if I can walk into that black wall or not. And I just keep walking one foot in front of the other, not knowing if I'm going to hit the wall, and that's my process of writing. But like, I just, I started listening to NPR and a documentary person had made a film called Obit. And it was just that word alone that got me thinking how, the reason why I can't write an elegy is because elegy is the wrong form for me, because my parents were both sick, and my dad is still alive, but for so long, it wasn't like a snap car crash or even like a 3-month illness. I mean, my dad has been sick for 12 years, and my mom was sick for like, as long as I can remember. She had the lung disease, but then it got really bad about 12 years ago, and then it's just every day is like this something new and something died. And so I think for me, the one elegy, even a book of elegies wasn't really going to be enough. It just didn't work for me. And that's why I kind of wrote out of that silence into the very first one. I put the very first one in the book, was my father's frontal lobe. And then once I wrote one, I don't know, I felt like it opened a floodgate for me. And the form helped me to sort of think about how my experience of grieving has been happening for as long as I can remember as an adult, going for a long time, not as a way to, don't feel sorry for me. It's fine. It's like, I'm perfectly okay, but it's just a part of my life. And so I think that so many things, I could have probably written 100 more of these, it's like, and so that's sort of how it came. But yeah, it is really fascinating because being a poet with a capital P, it's like, the last thing you want to be is sort of gimmicky or, these sort of project-based books that everyone thinks that you kind of set out to write this project-based book kind of thing. And you fear that, and right now I feel like we're in a world where we're almost forced to choose. It's like, do you want to be that like, commercially successful social media maven poet, or do you want to be like the totally obscure intellectual poet that like, no one reads? It's like there's no middle ground anymore. And I feel like everyone, it's like almost forces you to choose. It's like wait, this is a very, this, you know, this kind of world didn't exist even, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago as a poet. And so that question that you asked me always makes me think in along those lines and think about, gosh, you don't, like, you want readers as a poet, but you don't want so many readers that you become crass and commercialized. You know, it's just like this weird, we're in this weird kind of middle space right now. So I
No,
kind
I
of
mean,
answered
it
your
feels like 15
question.
years.
Yeah.
Sorry. I didn't
No,
mean to
no,
interrupt, but I was just going to say, it
no.
felt like
Yeah.
15 years ago, it felt like even 10 years ago, people were more or less asking the question, where are all the poets, right? There weren't,
Right.
poets did not have a very public profile until this, I think in part social media, where I think poetry translates so well to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, because if you do a screen capture and put the poem, I mean, you know, poems are compact. It's not pages. Often it's not pages of text, and so it translates really well. And it has done this kind of unusual, maybe surprising thing for those of us who were around 20 years ago to watch things kind of turn in this way. But I would never ever think of calling this book gimmicky. It doesn't have that, and that's where I think, going back to the word romanticized or it doesn't romanticize anything. It's a very sober book, but it's also a very earnest book. You know, it doesn't. That's why I think that's what is, not that it would need to be rescued, but like that's what prevents it from feeling gimmicky, is just the earnestness of the way in which the speaker in each of these poems addresses the thing that's being, you know, obituaried or obituarized,
Right.
whatever the verb form of that is. It's without a doubt, these are subjects that are so kind of close, it feels like. So it's an interesting book in the sense that, yes, it absolutely, back in the day when poetry was kind of divided into the experimental and the other thing, the lyric narrative, which it might still be, but this, it felt like really, it finds a middle ground, and it reminds me a little bit of that. Do you remember that Norton anthology, American Hybrid, that came out
Mm-hmm.
trying to like create a détente between the two alleged camps?
Was that David St. John that edited that
I
one?
cannot. It's over on the
I
shelf.
think it has a butterfly in it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's got the butterfly
Yeah, that's
on the
David St.
cover.
John. Yeah.
Yeah, and this feels like it has a quality that anthology was maybe hoping for, and
Mm-hmm.
this book has kind of fulfilled it, in the sense that there is a real beating heart underneath these poems, but they are not going to sacrifice experiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And formal experiment. And so there's no gimmick to them, but there is a real formalism to them. You know, that
Yeah.
the poems all you know, take a shape, and until there's section 2 where that shape kind of blows apart,
Mm-hmm.
and all this space comes in before we return to this shape. So it looks like a newspaper column. Is that the inspiration for the shape of these poems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking too about, you know, I thought a lot about this book, my book, and your book actually has given me a lot to think about too, because you know, the earnestness that you speak of feels so natural to me. The authenticness, I've heard people say, the honesty, the unflinching eye that other people have written about feels so natural to me, that when people point those things out to me, it's so bizarre. And you know what makes, what your book actually, if you can see it, of color, always helps me to frame that that all those things that people are saying is, it's about color. It's about me writing my experience and my lens of elegy and grief, and our family's experience through that process, as not a non-white experience.
Mm.
And my eye looking onto grief and into grief and around grief, above grief, under grief, threaded in between, is very much so what you talk about in your book of essays. And this in many ways, it's like, I think those of us who are BIPOC people, marginalized people, our experiences and the way we write about things is so subtly, sometimes not subtly, but in this case, I think Obit, subtly different, that people start using those words, which I think end up being, to kind of, bounce towards your book, sort of code for it doesn't very weight. And it's only until after a whole, like, maybe year of being interviewed by people and reading reviews and then reading your book, I've come to realize that, wait, I was just writing myself and writing out of my own experience, but somehow this experience feels different to other people, meaning mostly white readers or readers who have read mostly white experiences of death, of elegy, of anything really. And then it just gets me thinking so much about how so much of our literature that I came up reading was really through that lens of the white canon, the reading, the people writing, the people reading, even the way that we even turn around problems or issues or conflicts within poems is very much so based on a white experience. And your book really helped me and continues to help me, as does Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings, which I happen to have here as well. And they suddenly helped me think about these things and frame things in a different way. And, I think so much of our experiences as writers and readers and critics and canon makers, gatekeepers, etc., is so much based on familiarity. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a long, windy way towards or away from your question, but I've thought a lot about your book of essays, that it actually has helped me write this hybrid thing that I'm working on now. And I want to make the conversation fluid, because I think it's become fluid for me. Like, your book has been sort of this whole new way to kind of validate my own feelings, and
That's the nicest thing anybody said about that book, truly. And no offense to anybody who's said nice things about the book, but that's kind of an incredible thing to
I
hear.
related so much to it, and I felt so much connection to it that it made me so surprised at my own kind of connection and feelings. And it makes me feel brave. So you talk a lot in your book about, there's a chapter about assimilation, and it was so illuminating to me, just reading that chapter. And you talk, I mean, I put this on Twitter. The poet of color faces a similar conundrum. Will I be a writer or a minority writer?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm the former, adopting the English I'm taught in prep school and college and graduate school, I'm using a language assigned to somebody else while downplaying the issue of race. If I'm the latter, making race a central theme in my work, I risk alienating white readers or forcing myself into a niche where I can be disregarded as a novelty. I'm not making literature, I'm making ethnic literature. Like, just, there's so many gems in this book that it just really made me look back at my own experience and my own assumptions, and even my own writing, and asking myself, why do I write like this? What have I been trained to write like this, by whom, right? Anyway, so I don't know, I would love to hear because I feel like my book was just being me. I wasn't being particularly honest or authentic or anything. Like, when you were writing your book of essays, I felt like there were parts in there that were very personal, like the blonde girl coming up to you when you were by your bike, and like, that kind of broke my heart. And I don't know, do you feel like you're writing out of a place of like, did you feel scared to write those personal experiences. And then also the subject matter that you're writing about, the whole book is about many different things, but race is at the center of the book. And I mean, I guess, like, how did you feel about one, exposing your personal experiences to the world, but then two, writing about things that maybe a whole large majority of writers, white people, would not be interested in? Like, that occurred to me while I was reading it as well.
No, I mean, so the book came together over the course of like 10 years, really. Right? I mean, the first essay that I really ever wrote is the one called Writing Like a White Guy. That's the second essay in the book. And that was it was the first time I had ever directly confronted this subject of race and my life as a writer. And I, one thing that I is hard to do in the age of Twitter and scrutiny. Let's just call it the age of scrutiny, right? The one that we are in, is that it feels as if all of us are supposed to somehow be fully formed at all times. And I feel very fortunate for not having grown up in that period exclusively. So that I will be the first to say that my perspectives on race 20 years ago or 30 years ago are quite a bit different than they are now. It was a kind of thing, and you and I have talked about this, I think, outside of this context, but we were trained to disregard it or downplay it or however you want to frame that. And it wasn't, the people training us to do that were not nefarious deliberately. They were not trying to be oppressive. It was only after the fact that it became evident to me that there was a kind of oppression in that. And for all those years growing up on the north side of Chicago and then in the near north suburbs, the message that I was getting from all channels, whether it was the television or my family or my school or my friends, my cousins and other people that I grew up with, was always to fit in, right? That was crucial. And part of that fitting in was to minimize this issue of race, which I think it was a very naive perspective to believe that could even be done. But it was equally naive of the culture to demand that of anybody, right? To say, we're going to treat you like a brown person, like a black person, like a woman, like a queer person. We're going to treat you differently out of one side of our mouth while demanding that you be more like us out of the other side of our mouth. And again, this is what we mean when we talk about systemic racism, right? It's not that the individual is even cognizant that they're necessarily doing that. Right. They're congratulating you and trying to tell you, hey, here's how you're going to succeed. Do these things, right? It's only later that you stop and you go, oh, all of these things were male, straight, white things, right? And those are the things that keep being put on us. And so, when I wrote that essay, that was born of a pure accident. The poet and editor Joshua Murray Wilkinson has this website. Actually, it's a quite expansive kind of literary world that he created at Evening Will Come, and he's got like a journal of poetics called The Volta, and there was a round table on race and poetry he asked me to contribute to, and I meant to contribute 500 words, and it turned into this like 9,000 word essay, and that I had to cut back, and thankfully the Poetry Foundation published that, Poetry Foundation, who in the age of scrutiny have come into some, a rough patch of late, but they were really receptive and really supportive of this kind of work. And so it wasn't, I didn't know how to write an essay. I'd never done it. And I just started writing, and that's what came out, and people liked it. And so as far as the book goes, I did that like 9 more times over the course of 9 years. And then my wonderful editor, Daniel Levin Becker at McSweeney's, got in touch and said, hey, have you ever thought about doing a book? And I said, no, but of course I would love to look into this and see how it goes. I didn't know at that point if there was anything coherent there. But looking over the course of those 9 years, so many of these essays were, and some I wrote for the book, the last like 3 or 4 were written for the book, but we couldn't figure out a title. We were going back and forth. And the phrase I kept seeing over and over again, essay after essay, was of color, right? Writer of color, person of color. And it just kept coming up. And I went, oh shit, I think that this is a book about race, you know, in large part. And that's when I had already known that kind of in my life by then, that race was a major thing in almost everything I did through the course of a day. And I had never, I'd done the work of thinking about it enough that it became really evident to me. But to call the book of color was scary as shit, because I thought people are going to think that I'm kind of speaking for all people of color, which I'm not intending to do. They're going to think that I'm making broad pronouncements or prescriptions, which, so they're either going to be annoyed that I'm trying to speak for everybody, or they're going to be disappointed that I don't have more kind of polemical statements to make here. But really, I had to just be honest about where I have been with that subject. And that's what the essays are there. So it wasn't hard to be personal. It just felt like the only way to get at it. And that was a lesson that I learned from reading Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen, which another friend, the critic and poet Ray McDaniel, said, you know, the thing about that book is that it's just a book of witnessing. There is no argument to be made. The argument is already finished. All Rankine does is describe what's happened to her. And that is all the evidence you need to know that she is absolutely right. And sort of once I kind of heard that articulation, it really felt freeing to me in the sense that that's how I started to write the essays, was just describe what you see. And and that's what came out. And so
yeah, I love what Ray points out too with Claudia Rankine's book. You know, I think of that book as sort of like, because it's in second person, it puts all of these experiences onto a platter and then basically says, here you go, you know, as a waiter would, or waiter might, and allows you to sort of almost choose in some ways, but it's so powerful, it's still in your face that you can't do anything but see it, you know. And so I think it is so powerful. And I think that's, you know, I think that sort of, you talked about fear a few times, you know, of naming the book of color. And, you know, I think fear of maybe kind of getting on a soapbox or being too polemical with these kinds of essays. It's fascinating to me because I think part of that fear, for me at least, comes, I mean, it's external fear, but there's a part of me, a fear that comes from being unaccustomed to talking about these issues. So, you know, growing up in Michigan and being born in Michigan, a pretty white conservative state, the job of me as a human was to blend in as much as possible. And that is not everyone's experience as a BIPOC person in America, even during the time that you know, I was around. And you're a little bit younger than me, but you know, people who grew up in California did not experience that. But my job was to assimilate and to blend in. And the thing that you do so beautifully in this book, I think, is to address those losses and those griefs, and that have really helped me work on what I'm working on now, which is this hybrid kind of thing that talks a lot about the complicity of assimilation, the costs of assimilation, and you know, on 32, you say, my parents already know I'm bereft of their culture, that their son is almost as Frank or Bill as any other American. But they also believe this is necessary, that if their son is to become president, it won't happen while he's wearing a turban. They're willing to surrender their culture in order to assure my success, which means the price of my inclusion here is our alienation from each other. Like there's so much there, that like just that sort of like the way that I connected with this book was because I think we both had those experiences growing up in which we were, you know, even our own parents to some extent, you know, wanted us to surrender not only our culture but their culture, and in order to assure our success, which was a very sort of white way of success. And you know, you talk so much, and then you talk a lot, and then that ending just kind of made me think so much. You know, it means the price of my inclusion here is our alienation from each other. And now that my parents are, one is dead and one has pretty much been silent for 12 years, essentially dead in some ways to me. You know, it just, I think about that so much because by like they literally sacrificed themselves. I mean, people say that, oh, you say no, they sacrificed themselves and our relationship in order for us to be successful. And that you write about those things so well, and I've not read things like that before, except in academic articles. And you know, I mean, there are Asian, you know, Asian American academics writing articles about depression amongst Asian Americans, and you know, there's a whole field of people kind of looking at those types, but never in this kind of context. You know, it's like I've read plenty of essays by plenty of white people, and I really enjoyed them all, but I've never felt like this connected to any book before. And I hope this is the beginning of something, you know, in the future that, and you know, that more of us can do this kind of writing that's honest and you know, God forbid, from different experiences. It's like, you are not me. You are not the next, you know, South Asian American human. I am not the next. I'm not like Kathy Park Hong at all. Like we have nothing, zero in common. Yet I read that book and I was like, wow, I really connected with a lot of it. But I connected with yours more because Kathy grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up in Michigan. And so, you know, there's like all these nuances that I'm hoping that you know, in the future people can read and people can contribute to the canon of literature and expand it horizontally.
And this brings me to a question, because it occurs to me that one of the things that I experienced growing up in Chicago in the Midwest, right? And I went to school at Michigan for 3 years, so we have like a little bit of the overlap there. But is that like one of the reasons, so I'm confronting in the book that I'm working, and it's so funny, I discovered you were writing this book called Obit, and I had kind of already begun writing poems for what will be my 4th collection of poetry, and you know, hopefully it finds a way to publication and all that. And I was writing elegies, and then I saw that I was like, Victoria's writing obituaries, I'm going to go elegies. I'm like, wait. I remember saying to my wife, like, I think Victoria took my thing that I was doing. Then I was like, but of course not, because we're radically different writers, even though I have so much like affection and like admiration for your work. And, like, it was that flash of like, oh, if there's an obit book and then there's an elegy, and then I'm like, you idiot, like we know elegies, there's like 50 million elegies, like stop worrying about that. But it was like a split second. But the way that I'm like going about writing these elegies is they're like one of the working titles for the book, which I'm not going to call it this. I'm not going to follow up a book called The 44th of July, a book of poetry, and then write a book called Americanistan. I think it would be too on the nose a little bit, but that's a title of a poem in the collection. But that forms a kind of bedrock for the poems, in that they're a kind of elegy for a kind of 20th century version of America that I feel really close to, but it occurs to me as I'm going through this, um, how masculine the voice is in all of the poems, how kind of like dominated it is by this kind of very Midwestern white language and sensibility. But that was what I grew up with. And so was a long way of getting back to what you had just said, which your connection maybe with my book of essays is also born of the fact that we did not have a ton of role models, or in this world, in the American literary canon, it was either, if I were looking for a like South Asian writers in the 90s, I would have had to have either been in like high school or something like that, or in college. I would have had to either be like extremely plugged into like a deep literary circuit, I think, at that point, to have found like Jhumpa Lahiri, or Aga Shahid Ali, right? I wasn't gonna find that in the Norton that my Father Yitzin was giving us in high school, freshman English class. So all of my kind of role models ended up being these sort of middle ground characters, mostly men, not exclusively white, but often kind of countercultural. I remember really loving the story of and the paintings of Jean-Michel Basquiat when I discovered his work, and many people know that I really love the work of the poet David Berman, and these sort of voices that felt like they were right up against whiteness, but were staring at it at the same way while acknowledging how deeply influential it was on them somehow. Basquiat, I think, went to Juilliard. He was quite acquainted with the canon of Western painting, and was trying to emulate it to a certain respect. But so I guess my question then is, who did you read, and how did you arrive? Because your style at this point of poetry feels to me extraordinarily singular. Like nobody is writing like Victoria Chang. And like I look at the first book of yours that I think I read was The Boss, which I had not read a kind of like wild musicality like that. This sort of, it almost feels out of control until the poem like sticks its landing. It's just crazy how you do it. And you do it in this book too. It's just, they like the poems explode musically and they come back. And so one of the big questions I've had reading this is like, where did it come from? Like, we're all looking to each other now because I think we didn't have those kinds of role models necessarily, but who were yours in terms of writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably weren't super different from yours. I mean, I came up through that. So I had wanted to get an MFA since college, and it was just something that I had kind of heard of. And I went to University of Michigan, my undergraduate, but no one, is just like a lot of people like me. No one in my family really understood American literature. My mom was more interested in visual art, and I took a ton of art classes. I drew a lot growing up, and that was sort of what I was supposed to do in my spare time. And then my dad was an engineer. They're technical. They came over here in the 40s from Taiwan during this time where only technical people were sort of allowed in from Taiwan. And so, yeah, I didn't know it was an option. And, I had a bunch of English teachers in high school that, read me Hemingway. And I just wrote about this recently, actually. Dickinson, we had to memorize because I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Like, you literally remember all of these things that your high school teacher made you memorize, and meant nothing to me at the time. And so I read all the same stuff that you probably read. And then, it wasn't until I took a class randomly with Rick Barrett, who is now one of my very good friends, and probably one of yours as well. But like,
no, I don't know Rick. I know his work. I am infatuated with his work, but I've never met him.
Oh wow! So he's one of my oldest friends, and I've always been a huge fan. So, you know, of him and his work and his mind and the way it turns around different things. And I took a continuing studies class with him at Stanford. And, you know, it's like at that time, the reader did include like a lot of different kinds of white writers, poets, but, you know, occasionally there'd pop in there at that time. I mean, none of our reading lists were super diverse back then, but even like BIPOC writers and poets, I think were sneaking things in. So there'd be like a poem by Liang Li, or there'd be a poem by Suji Kwa Kim. There'd be a poem, there'd just be like maybe in a book of like a reader of like 100 poems, there'd be, you know, a selection of poems by people who were not white. And some of those poems were written in like the white writers, but with an Asian name, and others were a little bit different. And I don't know, I think that the rigor of that reader and the rigor of that class and the enthusiasm of Rick at that moment was perfect for me to sort of re-enter poetry. And I was already in my 30s and moving down a totally different path. But, you know, I think it had all the classic, you know, Bridget P. Jean Kellys and the Larry Levises. And so I went to Warren Wilson, and that was a continuation of that sort of white canon that I kept on reading. You know, I was told to read books like by Bishop, I love, you know, I mean, Wallace Stevens, Keats, and I had some amazing teachers, incredible minds that I'm so grateful for. But there were no poets of color that I was reading at all. And there weren't any to read. Like you'd have to go find them. Like it was pretty hard. And that's also what made me sort of want to put together an Asian American poetry anthology that I had edited, because I just couldn't find them. And now on the internet, you could find anything. But back then it's like, you'd have to go to the bookstore and see if they had the latest poetry magazine, and you flip through there and it's like you couldn't find anyone of color. And so yeah, I mean, it was like a thirsting to read poetry by non-white people, but not being able to find many poems by, you know, or just a token. So there's always like, okay, like the one Asian American poet is this person, the one, you know, Black poet is this person. It's just like there wasn't enough variety. And you know, if I read like Liang Li, I'd be like, that's cool, but that's not me. Or if I read Suji Kwa Kim, I'm like, no, I don't have that. Like Suji Kwa Kim and I are totally different. And so it's like, it wasn't enough, you know? And so that's what I read.
I think about that too with like South Asian writers, Asian writers, you know, writ large. I mean, even I had some amazing teachers too. In undergrad, I got to work with Dean Young. He was teaching at that time at Loyola University Chicago, where I went to undergrad. And he, I didn't know who he was. I took a class. He was brilliant, wonderful, amazing teacher, amazing poet. But yeah, his lists were what you described, right? Like it introduced me to people like James Tate, who has become a really important figure for me. And, you know, John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, this whole New York school is critical to my writing. Where I did run into Asian writers of color, it felt like generationally they were removed from where I was. It was like, I remember when a few years ago, Vijay Seshadri won the Pulitzer Prize, and I was excited. You know, I don't know Vijay Seshadri at all, but I was just excited to see that name would even be there.
Yeah,
you know?
I remember that.
But at the same time, when I read his work, I admire the work, but it doesn't feel generational. It doesn't feel
like your work.
Yeah, he's so much older, you know. And the other thing that actually that occurred to me as we were talking is that one of the things that feels slightly different, even between you and I, is that so there was that whatever it was, the J visa or whatever visa it was, that this whole like generation of Asian people came to this country, and often of this professional class in India, we would say the Brahmin class, they often came from at least some degree of wealth or learning. My parents were the generation or so after that, the 70s influx of immigrants that were led largely by a need for manufacturing people jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So working class jobs. And so it's also interesting to hear like that you were encouraged even by your parents to like do art, even if it was on the side. I remember my parents encouraged, like they were fine with me taking music classes because the teachers were saying, oh, you should encourage him to do this. But they were like, I remember being told I should take Latin and Greek, and they were like, why on earth? Take Spanish. It's much more useful and, and
Practical. Yeah.
practical. Everything was practical,
Yeah.
And so it occurs to me now that, the kinds of things that were imprinted upon me were often very pragmatic, but they were also in terms of like education and class and things like that. They were situated differently. And maybe that's why I didn't always connect with this older generation of writers that the few that I could even find. It was like they felt so learned to me,
Mm-hmm.
where I was drawn to the kinds of writers that were a little bit grungier, and a little bit more in the dive bars. And I remember reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and On the Road and all these books in high school, and like, but I liked those books. I liked those stories. They felt nearer to me than reading Anne Carson. That felt like I didn't have the brain for that. And so
but you're just as intellectual as Anne Carson. But it just I think the privilege is what you're talking about, and I think
we just deeply offended Anne Carson. But but no.
She won't watch this anyway. So.
But yeah, no, I mean the privilege. Sorry, you were about to say something there.
Oh no, I think there's so many layers of nuance that I'm hoping that this next generation of writers really brings to the table, and I hope the table is more of a field than a table, right? And I feel like we talked, and I do remember our conversation. We talked about this and came to the realization that our backgrounds were entirely different.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents were intellectually privileged. My dad has a PhD, and my mom has 2 masters, and they both went to the Harvard of Taiwan. Both of them, which is actually really unusual because it's really hard to get into.
Mm-hmm.
And they came here with nothing, but they had education. And it's like I always thought your parents were exactly the same as mine until we had that conversation. And then you talk about it in your book as well. Your dad did he drive a taxi for a while?
No. We had other people in our family that drove taxis. He actually passed.
He worked in
an industrial bakery. He
That's
worked.
right.
He was a machinist
right?
Yeah, that's what he did for years. But he did they did all the practical stuff. Like he got a real estate license. He did the taxi exam just in case.
Right.
All these. But they didn't come with education. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's so like I just I think that's so important that's it's like, whereas we've been reading white literature for so long, and we know the difference between a Larry Levis and a Bridget P. Jean Kelly and Elizabeth Bishop and a Marianne Moore, and we see these differences, we know these differences within a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
I just love the idea that we're now talking about these differences amongst people that other people would group together, and the differences I think can shape your writing and your view of the world in such interesting, different and unique ways. And I guess that's also what I really appreciate about having choice now. It's like, oh my goodness, I can read, like, I have Sejal Shah's book of essays that I'm still wanting to read. I haven't gotten around to it yet. And there's just so there's so many collections of poetry, but collections of essays by people that could be clumped in one category, and they're everybody's experience. I'm like, I can't wait to read Sejal Shah's book to see what her experience was like, and versus like, that is the experience of blah 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 person. And so I think that's something that I really enjoy about this time period, in literature.
The time period is extraordinary. I'm just thinking of like the books that I'm teaching, that like this is our common reader at University of Miami this semester. I mean, I'm teaching Tracy Smith's book, and along with Dean Young and Ross Gay, and I've got your, but it feels like, difference is now at our fingertips in a way that 20 years ago when I started my MFA, it was not. I mean, first of all, we didn't have online journals, right? And it was the gatekeeping was a lot more strict in many respects. And so that, I think, it encouraged diversity only, in the sense that if you matched a pre-existing kind of version of diversity, right? Like that's what, or I guess not, yeah, that might be a way of saying it, that like, if you were sufficiently brown, but also sufficiently accomplished in the high style, then you would be kind of let in. What feels different now is that there is a much broader range of aesthetic diversity among writers of color and white writers, and that is, it's a completely different context. And so I think the weirdest thing now is it's wonderful. There are no necessarily like tokenized representatives of an entire group of people, but now there is so much, the sheer volume, like you just described all these books that you haven't had a chance to read. And yeah, it's almost the opposite. It's like, I wish I could read all of these things. And then there's also the sense that like things have run right past my understanding because
yes.
I get old, I get old and everything, and everything starts to like feel like, oh, maybe my view is outdated already.
Outdated. Yeah, I think that all the time. I mean, we're not super young anymore. You're a little bit younger than me again, but not much, and I feel like there's so much to be learned from the next generations, plural. And it's partly why I know everyone hates Twitter, especially people above a certain age. I've always loved Twitter. And one of the reasons why I love Twitter is because of how much richness there is for me to hear other people and to learn. And sometimes the most controversial, the most sort of knee-jerk reactions I have to posts, the closer I pay attention to them. And by the most sort of like loudest controversial voices saying controversial things, I want to hear all of that. I want to learn from people that are more progressive than I am. I want to hear from people who are more conservative than I am. I want to hear people who are 30 years younger than me. I want to hear what they have to say about literature and about poetry and how they read things. And because I scratch my head sometimes, I'm like, wow, I never thought about this, something that way before, or that wasn't my reaction to this poem. But once I read someone saying something, I'm like, whoa, I can actually understand that now. Because you talk about this in your book about it feels like that there's a complicity that you and I and our generation perhaps had in our own erasure. And maybe that's projecting my own words onto yours, but that's sort of what I took from it. And I do think like we didn't have the technology, and I always say this, it's like I'm repeating myself, we didn't have the technology, we didn't have the tools. It's like if today we have like guns and rifles. I don't know why I'm talking about weapons, but it's like back, like we had like our little bow and arrows,
right.
And we didn't really like we were a bit handicapped is the wrong word. We were our hands were bound, we only had so much to work with. And so to understand sort of where we came from is to also acknowledge our complicity in our own erasure, in our own invisibility. And I think that's an important part of also forgiving our generation too, and having empathy for us from other generations, but within our own generation of how we led to our own erasure, but looking at the next generations and trying as much as possible to put our ear to the ground and listen to see what other people tell us.
We need to do it. You're actually maybe convincing me to join Twitter, but I was on Twitter.
I can't believe you're not on Twitter.
I was on and then I quit. I couldn't do it. It was too distracting, addictive. I don't know how to describe it. I'm on it right now. I'm on it right now in secret, just to follow a bunch of journalists tracking the election, because the news is moving faster than websites can keep up.
So fast. Yeah, that's where you get the news. Yeah, for better or for worse.
It is. So it's a little bit. I'm secretly on Twitter, but exclusively for that reason. I don't write anything. But yeah, it is. You know, we were smaller. We were a smaller generation. There were fewer of us. That's true writ large of Gen X in the U.S., but then also especially, I just didn't. God, I just did not have a lot of South Asian or Asian people around. My grade school, there were like two of us.
I know.
In my high school, there were like a handful. You all knew each other.
I know.
There was a certain way in which like you were kind of trained not to like necessarily hang out, or because you didn't want to be clumped together. I don't know how to describe it.
Oh yeah,
it was such a strange
you described
thing.
it. Yeah.
But we are getting a 5-minute warning. So
That's
I
right.
thought
before
we wrapped up, I was hoping you would read a poem.
Me? Okay.
Yeah. Hoping you would
Sure.
do that. And
do you want me to read a particular one, or I could just pick one?
I kind of. Well, why don't you pick? Because there are a bunch I like, but then I don't want to give one to you. Then you're like, oh, I don't really like that one, So.
Or one that I've never read before.
Yeah.
Sure. I'll just read one I just opened to page 70. So I'll just read page 70. And this one's called Grief. Oddly, Grief. Grief, as I knew it, died many times. It died trying to reunite with other lesser deaths. Each morning, I lay out my children's clothing to cover their grief. The grief remains, but is changed by what it is covered with. A picture of oblivion is not the same as oblivion. My grief is not the same as my pain. My mother was a mathematician, so I tried to calculate my grief. My father was an engineer, so I tried to build a box around my grief, along with a small wooden bed that grief could lie down on. The text kept interrupting my grief, forcing me to speak about nothing. If you cut out a rectangle of a perfectly blue sky, no clouds, no wind, no birds, frame it with a blue frame, place it face up on the floor of an empty museum with an open atrium to the sky, that is grief.
Yeah, it's just freaking extraordinary work. I mean,
Same for you.
I can't admiration doesn't cut. It was like downright envy reading this book at times, just going, being like, oh my God, of course I would never have thought to write that line, but I so wish I had, you know what I mean?
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.
Across the board. And it's going to bleed into my stuff. And so if my book eventually gets published and you read it and you're like, hey, he stole that from you.
That's fine.
Right now. Doing a gesture or a move from you.
Writing is sharing, right? We share words into the world. Otherwise, we'd be writing diaries. So
it's true. We share, we influence, and that's the idea. And
that's the idea.
And steal if you're good, right? Borrow. Yeah. Thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, I know you and I could go on for another 3 hours, so we should probably stop.
I know. We'll stop here, and it's I can't obviously read an essay in 2 minutes, so I'm not going to read. But thank you to Christina Carnes and everybody for hosting us. And yeah, it's been awesome to talk to you and catch up. And thank you for reading my book.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you for writing it, and thanks for the conversation. It's such a pleasure always to chat with you.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, take care.
Bye, everybody.